midnight, a broken station, a storm that wouldn't stop, and a mother holding on to her son like he was the last piece of the world she had left. No home, no future, no way forward. Until a man stepped out of the shadows and changed everything, with nothing more than a coat and a belief that kindness still mattered. But sometimes the smallest actions carry the greatest consequences. And this night would change all of their lives forever.
The wind didn't just blow, it bit. It howled through the rotting floorboards of the Redemption train station, carrying the bitter chill of a Kansas October. Hail lashed against the tin roof in hard, angry strikes, like a fist banging on a closed door. Inside the small waiting room, the kerosene lamps flickered. They cast long, trembling shadows across the scuffed wooden floors. It was near midnight. The station was mostly empty, save for a few drifters sleeping on the benches and the station master behind his iron-grated window. And Martha. Martha Hayes stood near the center of the room. Her posture was rigid, her spine straight as a surveyor's pole. She wore a faded gray wool dress, hemmed with the dried mud of the long walk from town. In one hand, she held a battered leather valise. It held everything she owned, everything the bank hadn't taken. Her other hand was held tight, gripped with startling strength by her 8-year-old son, Will. Martha didn't cry. She hadn't shed a single tear since 3 o'clock that afternoon. That was when Elias Thorne's men had come to the house. They brought a hammer, a heavy iron padlock, and a piece of paper stamped with the red seal of the county. Foreclosure. Her husband's hidden gambling debts had finally caught up to them, 2 years after they had buried him. She had watched them drive the nails into her front door. She had watched 11 years of her life become the property of the bank, and she had simply turned around, taken Will's hand, and walked away. "I can hold the bag, Mama." The voice was small, but it tried so hard to be deep. Martha looked down. Will was staring up at her. His small jaw was set. His eyes, dark and entirely too old for an 8-year-old face, were scanning the room. He watched the drifters. He watched the station master. He watched the shadows. He had been doing this all evening, acting like a sentry, acting like the man of a house that no longer existed. "It's too heavy, Will," Martha said quietly. Her voice was flat, hollowed out. "I'm strong," the boy insisted. He reached over with his free hand and tried to pry her fingers from the leather handle. "You need to rest. I can hold it." Martha felt a sudden sharp ache in her chest, a crack in the ice. She squeezed his hand gently, giving him a small, tired smile. "I know you are, but right now I need you to hold my hand. That helps me more." Will considered this. He nodded once, a sharp, serious motion. He let go of the bag and tightened his grip on her fingers. He took a half-step forward, positioning himself slightly in front of her, shielding her from the draft coming under the door, shielding her from the world. He was 8, and his childhood had ended at 3 o'clock that afternoon. Across the room, the telegraph machine began to click, a frantic, sharp noise over the steady drone of the rain. The station master leaned over his desk, reading the incoming tape. He sighed, rubbed his face with a heavy hand, and slid open the glass window. "Attention!" he called out. His voice echoed off the damp walls. "The northbound line is washed out. Mudslide just past the gorge. The 12:15 to Philadelphia ain't coming." Martha froze. Her breath caught in her throat. "When?" a man grumbled from one of the benches. "Tomorrow morning, best case," the station master said, shutting the glass with a sharp clack. "Station closes in 20 minutes. You folks can't sleep here. Fire code, out you go." Martha stared at the closed ticket window. Her mind raced. The panic, kept at bay for hours by sheer willpower, began to claw at the edges of her mind. Tomorrow morning. She had exactly enough money for 1 adult ticket and 1 half-fare child's ticket. She had 2 copper pennies left over. She could not rent a room at the boarding house. She could not buy a hot meal. And she could not walk the streets of Redemption in the dead of night. Not with a child. Not in this freezing rain. They were trapped. "Mama?" Will whispered. He felt her hand tremble, just slightly, but he felt it. "Are we staying?" "We'll find a place to wait," Martha said. Her voice was steady, but it cost her everything to keep it that way. "Just for tonight." She led Will toward the heavy wooden double doors leading out to the covered platform. If they couldn't stay inside, they would hunker down under the eaves outside. It would be cold, bitterly cold, but the roof would keep the hail off them. She pushed the door open. The wind immediately grabbed it, nearly tearing it from her hinges. She forced it shut behind them, stepping out onto the wooden planks of the platform. It was freezing. The temperature had plummeted since nightfall. The wind whipped rain sideways under the awning. Martha found a bench pressed tightly against the brick wall of the station, shielded slightly from the worst of the wind. She sat down, pulling Will up beside her. She unbuttoned her thin wool shawl and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders. "I'm not cold," Will lied. His teeth were chattering. "Just wear it," Martha said, wrapping her arms around him, pulling him tightly against her chest. She buried her face in his hair. He smelled of rain and boyish sweat and the lavender soap they had used that morning, back when they still had a bathtub, back when they still had a home. She closed her eyes. She prayed. She didn't know who she was praying to anymore. But she asked for the wind to stop, just for the boy. From the far end of the platform, a match flared. A sudden scratch in the darkness. A burst of yellow light. Martha's eyes snapped open. Her grip on Will tightened instantly. Her defensive walls, built high and thick over the last 2 years, slammed into place. In the brief flash of the match, she saw him. A man leaning against the wooden piling at the far end of the platform. He was tall, broad-shouldered. The brim of his hat was pulled low over his eyes. He cupped his hands around a rolled cigarette, breathing in. The tip glowed red in the shadows. He had been there the whole time, watching. Martha didn't look away. She stared hard at the shadow, projecting a fierce, quiet warning. "Do not approach us. I am not a victim. I will fight." The man didn't move. He took a slow drag of his cigarette. He looked out at the rain. He looked down at his boots. Then he looked at Will. Even in the dim light of the station window, Will's shivering was obvious. The boy was trying to hide it, but the cold was sinking into his bones. The man pushed off the wooden piling. He didn't walk fast. He didn't strut. He walked with heavy, deliberate steps. The sound of his boots on the wet planks was rhythmic, measured. He stopped a few feet away from their bench. He was older, maybe early 40s. His face was weathered, lined by sun and wind and years of hard living. His eyes were a pale, striking gray, like a winter sky just before it snows. He didn't look dangerous, but he didn't look soft either. He took one last drag of his cigarette and flicked it out into the rain. The ember hissed and died. Without a word, he reached up and unbuttoned his coat. It was heavy cowhide, thick, lined with fleece. It looked like it weighed 10 pounds. He slipped it off his shoulders. He stepped forward. Martha immediately stood up, placing herself directly between the man and her son. "Keep walking, mister," she said. Her voice was sharp, a crack of a whip in the cold air. The man stopped. He looked at her. He didn't look angry. He just looked tired. "I don't want your money," he said. His voice was gravelly, deep, quiet, but it carried over the wind. "I don't want your time." He stepped to the side, bypassing her defensive stance without challenging it, and held the heavy coat out toward Will. "Put this on, son." Martha's pride, her only remaining possession, flared hot in her chest. The town of Redemption had looked at her with pity for 2 years. They had whispered about her. They had judged her. She would not sit here and take charity from a stranger in the dark. "I said no," Martha snapped, stepping forward to block his arm. "We don't need your help. We don't take charity. We don't owe anybody anything." The man looked at her hand, raised as if to strike him away. Then he looked up at her face. He didn't pull the coat back. He held it right where it was. He met her eyes squarely. And when he spoke, his words were clear, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. "Kindness is not a debt, ma'am," he said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "A society that lets a child freeze while men count coins in warm houses is not a society worth living in. Accepting help in times of hardship is a fundamental human right, not a loss of dignity." Martha froze. The words struck her like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. They cut through her pride. They cut through the thick, desperate armor she had wrapped around herself all afternoon. Accepting help is a fundamental human right. She stared at the man. He wasn't pitying her. He wasn't looking down on her. He was looking at her like an equal who had just taken a bad fall in the mud, offering a hand up. Will stepped out from behind his mother. He looked at the man. Then he looked at the coat. "Are you going to be cold?" Will asked, his small voice cutting through the tension. The corners of the man's eyes crinkled. Just a fraction. It was the ghost of a smile. "I've been cold before. I know how to handle it. You take the coat." Will looked up at Martha, asking for permission. Martha looked at the heavy leather jacket. She looked at her son's blue lips. The pride drained out of her, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion. She slowly lowered her hand. She nodded. Will reached out and took the coat. He wrapped it around himself. It dwarfed him completely. It hung down past his knees. But instantly, the shivering slowed. The thick fleece smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and safety. "Thank you," Will said solemnly. "Don't mention it," the man said. He didn't linger. He didn't wait for Martha to apologize or say thank you. He simply turned around and walked back down the platform. He went to the furthest corner, the darkest spot, where the wind was blocked, but the view of the platform was clear. He sat down on a crate. He leaned his back against the brick wall. He pulled his hat low over his eyes, crossed his arms over his flannel shirt, and settled in. Martha watched him. She slowly sat back down on the bench. She pulled Will against her side. The heavy leather coat acted like a furnace, warming them both where their bodies pressed together. "Mama?" Will whispered, his eyes drooping heavy now that the cold wasn't fighting him. "Yes, Will." "Who is he?" "I don't know," Martha said softly. She looked down the platform. The shadow in the corner hadn't moved. "He's staying," Will noted, his voice slurring with sudden heavy sleep. "He's watching the door." "Go to sleep, Will." "I have to stay awake," the boy mumbled, his head dropping onto her lap. "Have to guard you." "I'm guarded," Martha whispered, stroking his hair. "You did a good job. You can sleep now." Will didn't argue. Within seconds, his breathing evened out. He was gone, buried deep in the heavy folds of a stranger's coat. Martha sat there in the dark. The wind continued to howl. The rain continued to fall. The town of Redemption slept in their warm beds, having kicked her out into the cold. But as the hours ticked by, the man in the corner never lit another match. He never closed his eyes. He sat perfectly still in the freezing damp, his gaze locked on the open platform, watching the shadows so the boy wouldn't have to. He never said another word, and he never left. The morning came gray and quiet. The hail had stopped some time before dawn. It left behind a world of freezing mud and shattered pine needles. Inside the Redemption station, the air was stale. It smelled of wet wool and cheap tobacco. Martha's neck ached. She sat on the hard wooden bench, her back stiff. Will was still asleep, his head resting in her lap, bundled in the stranger's heavy leather coat. She looked toward the corner. The man was gone, just an empty crate, a few boot prints tracking mud toward the door. Martha felt a sudden sharp twist in her chest. Relief, she told herself. It was relief. You couldn't trust a man who sat in the dark all night. But as she smoothed Will's hair, her fingers brushed the thick fleece of the coat. He had left it. The station master's window slid open with a screech. Martha stood. She gently moved Will so his head rested on the bench. He stirred, but the coat kept him under. She walked to the window. Her boots felt heavy. "The northbound tracks," she said. Her voice was scratchy. "Are they cleared?" The station master didn't even look up from his ledger. "Told you last night, lady, it's a mudslide. Half the mountain came down. Telegraph says 5 days. Minimum." 5 days. The words hit her like a physical weight. She reached into her pocket. Her fingers traced the edges of her remaining coins. She didn't need to count them. She knew exactly what was there. $1.12. It wasn't enough. Not for 5 days of food, not for a room. She turned away from the window. The panic wasn't clawing at the edges anymore. It was sitting right in the center of her chest. She walked toward the heavy double doors and pushed them open. The cold air slapped her face. She stepped out onto the platform, wrapping her thin shawl tighter. She needed to think. She needed a plan. A wagon was parked near the edge of the platform, a sturdy flatbed thing hitched to 2 massive roan horses. And leaning against the wagon wheel was the man from last night. He was holding a cup of steaming coffee in one hand. In the other, he held the reins. In the daylight, he looked exactly the same, weathered, tired, solid. He saw her. He didn't wave. He just took a slow sip of his coffee. Martha stopped. She waited for him to approach, to ask for his coat back, to ask for a favor in return. He didn't. He just stood there. Finally, the silence became too loud. Martha walked over. She kept her chin high. "My son is still sleeping," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. "I will return your coat as soon as he wakes." "No rush," he said. His voice was deep. It had a gravelly pull to it like wheels on a dirt road. "Mornings are cold." Martha studied him. "You waited." "I was waiting on the general store to open," he corrected mildly. "Needed nails." It was a lie. The general store had been open for an hour. She could see the open sign flapping down the street. She didn't call him on it. "The train is delayed 5 days," she said. She didn't know why she told him. The words just spilled out. The man nodded. He didn't look surprised. "I heard." He looked out toward the muddy road, then back to her. "I run a cattle outfit," he said. 40 miles west of here. Name's Silas Vance." "Martha Hayes," she replied, out of sheer habit. Silas gave a short nod. "I got 3 hands working for me. Good men. Bad cooks. We've been eating burnt beans and hardtack for 6 months. I need someone to run the kitchen, wash the linens, keep the dust out of the house." He looked her straight in the eye. 5 days, Silas said. "I offer room, board, and $5 for the week's work. You work, I pay. It's a business transaction, nothing more." Martha stared at him. The wind whipped her skirt around her ankles. $5. Room and board. It was exactly what she needed. It was a lifeline thrown into a drowning sea. But she had learned the hard way that lifelines usually had a hook hidden inside the rope. $5? Martha asked. Her brow furrowed. The defensive wall shot right back up. "You pay your ranch hands $5 a week to break their backs in the sun. I am a woman. I would be boiling water and scrubbing pots. Why would you offer me the exact same wage as a man doing hard labor? Is this pity, Mr. Vance? Because I told you last night, stop right there." Silas didn't raise his voice, but the tone cut her off completely. He set his coffee cup down on the wagon bed. He turned to face her fully. His gray eyes were hard, serious. "Labor is measured by its output, not gender, ma'am," Silas said. The words were deliberate, spoken with absolute clarity so she couldn't miss a single syllable. "Any woman or man who sweats on this earth deserves equal respect and equal pay. True equality begins at the dinner table and in the daily work we do. You feed my men, they have the strength to work. Your labor makes their labor possible. It's worth $5. Pity doesn't run a ranch. Fair wages do." Martha stood perfectly still. She had lived in Philadelphia society. She had lived in a dusty Kansas frontier town. She had known politicians, bankers, and farmers. Never in 38 years had a man spoken to her like that. not with flowery compliments, not with condescension, but with plain, undeniable respect. She looked at his calloused hands. She looked at his steady gaze. He wasn't playing a game. He meant every word. "I make a very good biscuit," Martha said. Her voice was quiet now. The fight had drained out of it. "Then we have a deal," Silas said. He reached his hand out. Martha looked at it. Then she reached out and took it. His grip was firm, warm, grounding. "Go get the boy," Silas said, turning back to his horses. "It's a long ride." The wagon ride took hours. The Kansas prairie stretched out endlessly, a sea of dead yellow grass rolling under a heavy gray sky. The mud sucked at the wagon wheels, making the journey agonizingly slow. Martha sat on the wooden bench beside Silas. Will sat between them. The boy was exhausted. He had barely slept the night before. His small body swayed with every bump in the road. But his eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead. Every few minutes he would blink heavily, his head dropping forward. Then he would jerk awake, sitting up straight, glancing at Silas, then at the road. He was guarding. Martha watched him. Her heart ached. She reached over and rubbed his back. "Will, you can sleep. It's safe." "I'm awake," Will mumbled. His voice was thick. "I'm watching the road." Silas held the reins loosely. He didn't turn his head. He just kept his eyes on the horizon. An hour passed. The road smoothed out slightly as they hit higher ground. The rhythmic rocking of the wagon became hypnotic. Will's chin hit his chest. He jerked up. 5 minutes later, it happened again. This time, when he swayed, he tilted sideways. His head landed squarely against Silas's upper arm. Martha gasped softly. She reached out immediately to pull Will away. "You didn't touch strangers. You didn't lean on men you barely knew." Before her fingers could grab Will's shoulder, Silas shifted. He didn't pull away. He didn't shrug the boy off. Instead, he subtly adjusted his posture. He leaned slightly into the boy's weight, bracing his arms so Will wouldn't slide off. He transferred the reins entirely to his left hand, leaving his right arm steady as a stone pillar. He never looked down. He never said a word. Martha froze, her hand hovering in the cold air. She looked at her son. Will's face was relaxed. His breathing was deep and even. He was completely asleep, safe, supported. Martha slowly lowered her hand to her lap. She looked at Silas. The harsh lines of his profile were set against the bleak Kansas sky. He was a stranger, a man made of dust and leather. But as the wagon rolled on, Martha felt something strange settle in her chest. She wasn't cold anymore. The Vance Ranch wasn't much to look at. No fresh white paint, no sweeping porches. It was a collection of sturdy, weather-beaten buildings sitting in the middle of nowhere. A 2-story pine house, a massive barn, corrals made of thick cedar posts. It looked like it had grown right out of the dirt. Functional, tough, surviving. Silas pulled the wagon up to the front of the house. 3 men walked out of the barn. They stopped in the yard, wiping grease and dirt on their trousers. They stared at the wagon. Specifically, they stared at the woman in the gray dress and the small boy holding her hand. Silas wrapped the reins around the brake lever and stepped down. "Hiram, Javier, Ned," Silas said. He didn't raise his voice, but it carried across the yard. "This is Mrs. Hayes and Will. They're staying the week. Mrs. Hayes is running the kitchen." Hiram was older, 50s, a face like a dried apple and eyes that missed nothing. He chewed on a toothpick. He nodded once. Javier was Mexican, mid-30s. Dust coated his dark hair. He took off his hat and offered a polite, sweeping bow. Ned was barely 19, lanky, freckled. He blushed furiously, looked at his boots, and mumbled a greeting. None of them asked questions. In the West, you didn't ask why a woman with no bags was riding with your boss. You just minded your business. "Kitchen's in the back, ma'am," Hiram said. His voice was rough. "Stove's probably cold." "I know how to build a fire," Martha said. She didn't smile. She just grabbed Will's hand and walked toward the house. The kitchen was large but neglected. It smelled of stale grease and burnt coffee. The cast-iron stove was covered in a layer of ash. There was a sack of flour on the counter, a tin of lard, and a bowl of wrinkled potatoes. Martha took off her shawl. She rolled up her sleeves. "Will," she said, "go outside. Stay on the porch. Don't go near the animals yet." Will nodded. He walked out the back door, sitting on the wooden steps like a small, silent sentry. Martha went to work. She didn't stop to cry. She didn't stop to rest. She cleaned the ash from the stove. She hauled wood from the pile out back. She struck a match and got the fire roaring. She found a bucket, went to the pump, and hauled water. Physical labor was a language. It was honest. It didn't lie. She buried her hands in the flour. She worked the lard in with her fingers. She felt the dough come together, heavy, substantial. She peeled potatoes until her thumbs cramped. She found a ham bone in the cold box and started a broth. For 3 hours, the only sounds in the house were the crackle of the fire, the chopping of a knife, and the rhythmic thud of a rolling pin. At noon, the dinner bell rang in the yard. The back door opened. Hiram, Javier, and Ned walked in. They took off their hats. They stood frozen just inside the door. The smell of stale grease was gone. The kitchen smelled of hot, rising yeast, savory ham broth, black pepper. Martha didn't look up from the stove. She pulled a heavy cast-iron skillet from the oven. Inside were 12 enormous golden-brown biscuits. Steam rose from them in thick clouds. "Plates are on the table," Martha said. "Wash your hands at the pump first." They didn't argue. They scrambled out the door, washed up, and filed back in. They sat at the long wooden table. Martha brought over the skillet of biscuits. She brought over a heavy pot of potato and ham stew. She set them down. "Eat," she said. They ate. They didn't talk. They didn't make jokes. They just ate with a desperate, silent reverence. Hiram closed his eyes after his first bite of a biscuit. Javier made a quiet, approving sound in his throat. Ned ate 3 bowls of stew before putting his spoon down. When they were finished, Hiram stood up. He picked up his empty plate and carried it to the wash basin. He looked at Martha. "I ain't eaten like that since my wife passed 10 years ago," Hiram said quietly. "Thank you, ma'am." "You're welcome, Hiram," Martha said. She had earned her place, not through pity, not through Silas's protection. She earned it with flour, fire, and her own 2 hands. Outside, the afternoon sun finally broke through the gray clouds. Will was standing by the corral fence. He was small against the thick wooden rails. His hands were stuffed in his pockets. He was watching a massive dirt-brown gelding grazing near the fence. Silas walked out of the barn. He carried a heavy leather halter. He saw Will at the fence. He stopped. He watched the boy for a long minute. Will's shoulders were tight. His jaw was clenched. Even standing still, looking at a horse, the boy looked like he was preparing for a fight. He looked like a soldier waiting for the enemy to crest the hill. Silas walked over. He leaned his arms on the top rail of the fence, standing right next to Will. "That's Buster," Silas said. Will flinched slightly at the sudden voice, but quickly recovered. He nodded sharply. "He's big." "He is. He's stubborn, too, but he's honest. You always know where you stand with Buster." Silas unlatched the gate. He stepped inside the corral. He didn't close it all the way. He left a gap, enough for a boy to slip through. "Come on," Silas said. "Let him smell you." Will hesitated. He looked back at the house. He looked at the horse. Then slowly he slipped through the gap in the fence. He stood a few feet behind Silas. Buster lifted his massive head. He snorted a deep rumbling sound and took a step forward. Will stiffened, his hands curling into small fists. He didn't step back. He stood his ground, terrified but refusing to show it. Silas reached out and grabbed Will's wrist, gently. He uncurled Will's fist, pressing the boy's palm flat. "Keep it flat," Silas instructed quietly. "Never hide your hands from a horse. Let him see what you bring." Silas guided Will's flat hand up. Buster stretched his neck out. His velvet nose touched Will's palm. The horse exhaled, warm air rushing over the boy's skin. Will's breath caught. His eyes went wide. Slowly, the rigid tension in his shoulders began to melt. Just a fraction. "He likes you," Silas said, stepping back slightly, letting Will stand on his own. Will kept his hand on the horse's nose. "I have to be good with horses, if I'm going to run things." The words were spoken softly, but they hit Silas like a hammer. Silas looked down at the 8-year-old boy. He saw the dark bags under Will's eyes. He saw the exhaustion that went deeper than missed sleep. He saw a child trying to carry a house that had already burned to the ground. Silas knelt down in the dirt. He didn't care about the mud on his knees. He got right down to Will's eye level. He waited until Will stopped looking at the horse and looked directly at him. "Will," Silas said. His voice was low, gentle, but carrying an absolute, unbreakable weight. "Look at me." Will looked. "You're a brave boy," Silas said, spacing the words out. "And you have a good heart. But you're only 8 years old." Will swallowed hard. His chin trembled, but he tightened his jaw to stop it. "Listen to me clearly," Silas continued, making sure the boy heard every single word. "Children have the right to simply be children. Wanting to protect your family is honorable. It shows what kind of man you're going to be. But you don't have to carry the pain or your mother's safety all by yourself. You are not the father of that house. You are the son." Will's eyes filled with tears. He fought them. He blinked furiously. "Healing means allowing the adults around you to share that burden," Silas said explicitly. "You don't have to guard the door every minute. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to play. You are allowed to let the adults be the adults." The first tear spilled over Will's eyelashes. It cut a clean track down his dusty cheek. He didn't sob. He didn't wail. He just stood there, his hands still resting on the horse, and let the tears fall silently. Silas didn't try to stop him. He didn't tell him to act like a man. He just stayed kneeling in the dirt, keeping a steady, solid presence. "I'm tired, Mr. Silas," Will whispered. It was the truest thing the boy had ever said. "I know you are, son," Silas said softly. "I know." Silas stood up. He put his large, heavy hand on Will's shoulder. He didn't push. He just let the weight of his hand rest there. A silent promise. A transfer of duty. "Let's go wash up," Silas said. "Your mama made biscuits. It's time to eat." Will wiped his face with his sleeve. He took one last look at the horse, then looked up at Silas. He nodded. They walked back toward the house together. Will didn't walk in front to guard the path. He didn't trail behind to watch their backs. He walked right beside the tall rancher. For the first time in 2 years, the boy let someone else take the watch. The trouble didn't ride in on a dark horse. It came in a canvas mailbag. It was the afternoon of their 3rd day at the ranch. The mud from the storm was finally starting to bake solid under a pale sun. Martha was in the kitchen, kneading a fresh batch of dough. Will was out by the corral, sitting on the bottom fence rail, watching Javier brush down the horses. Hiram rode into the yard. He had taken the supply wagon into Redemption that morning. He didn't look happy. He pulled the wagon to a halt. He wrapped the reins around the brake and climbed down. He didn't head for the barn. He walked straight toward the main house. He held a thick yellow envelope in his hand. Silas was on the porch fixing a broken leather cinch. He looked up. Hiram stopped at the bottom of the steps. He tapped the envelope against his leg. "Postmaster gave me this," Hiram said. His voice was tight. "Said it came over from the county courthouse just before the telegraph lines went dead." Silas put down his tools. He stood up. He wiped his hands on his trousers and took the envelope. He looked at the seal. Red wax. Official. He looked at the name written in looping black ink. Mrs. Martha Hayes. "Thorne's Bank?" Silas asked quietly. Hiram spat into the dirt. "Worse. I heard talk in town, Silas. Thorne ain't just settling for the house. He's making a play for the boy." Silas went perfectly still. His gray eyes turned to ice. "Explain." Thorne's got no heirs, Hiram said. And he's got a lot of land that needs clearing. He filed a writ using that new statute, the one from last year. Says a widow without means or property ain't fit to raise a child. He's asking the court to make him the boy's legal guardian. Ward of the state. That's what the paper would say. But out here, a ward of a man like Elias Thorne was just an unpaid farmhand. A slave with a legal title. The train runs in 2 days, Hiram added. If she gets on it, Thorne's sheriff will pull the boy right off the platform. Legal kidnapping. Silas looked at the envelope. It felt heavy. Too heavy for paper. He turned and walked into the house. Martha was at the table. Her hands were covered in white flour. She looked up and smiled. A small, genuine thing. It was the first time Silas had seen it. It vanished the second she saw his face. She wiped her hands on her apron. What is it? Silas set the envelope on the table, right next to her bowl of dough. From town, a court writ. Hiram heard the talk. Martha stared at the yellow paper. She didn't touch it. What does it say? Elias Thorne, Silas said, keeping his voice steady, grounded. He's petitioning the county. He wants custody of Will, claiming you're unfit because of the foreclosure. The air left the room. Martha took a step back. She hit the edge of the iron stove. She didn't feel the heat. Her face went entirely pale. The flour on her cheek suddenly matched the color of her skin. She stared at the envelope. Her chest heaved. A ragged, terrible breath tore out of her throat. She didn't cry. She got angry. She lunged forward. She grabbed the envelope with her flour-covered hands, tearing it open. The thick parchment ripped. She pulled out the legal document. Her eyes scanned the dense typed words. Her hands shook. They shook so hard the paper rattled. "He wants my son," she whispered. Her voice was pure venom. "He took my home. He took everything my husband built. And now he thinks he can take my child." "Martha," Silas said. "No." She slammed the paper onto the table. "He thinks I'm a stray dog. He thinks because I don't have $1 to my name, I don't have a voice. He thinks he can just buy my boy." She paced across the kitchen, back and forth, like a trapped wolf. "I won't let him. I will kill him first. I will walk into his bank and put a bullet in his chest before I let him touch my son." "Martha, stop." Silas stepped into her path. He grabbed her shoulders, firmly but not hard enough to bruise. He forced her to stop pacing. He forced her to look at him. "You aren't killing anybody," Silas said. "You aren't going to jail, and you aren't losing that boy." "You don't know the law out here," she cried out, hitting his chest with her fists. "Once, twice. A man with money writes the law, Silas. I have nothing." "You have me," he said. She froze. Her fists rested against his chest. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, wild, and terrified. "You're standing in my house," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, solid rumble. "You eat at my table. That makes this my fight, too. I don't care how much money Elias Thorne has. He isn't stepping foot on this land." Martha closed her eyes. A sob broke loose, just one before she swallowed it down. She nodded against his chest, just once. She pulled away. She picked up the paper. She smoothed out the wrinkles. Her face was set in stone again. "I need to read this," she said coldly. "I need to read every word." Silas left her to it. He walked back out to the front porch. Hiram was still standing there. He had heard the yelling. Javier and Ned had come up from the barn, standing quietly by the wagon. They all looked at Silas. "She ain't going to win, boss," Hiram said softly. "The law is the law. Thorne bought the county judge 2 years ago. We can't fight a legal writ with rifles. We'll all hang." Silas walked down the steps. He looked at Hiram. He looked at the 2 younger men. The wind picked up, kicking dust across the yard. "Hiram, you listen to me," Silas said. His voice was loud enough for all 3 men to hear perfectly. Every word was sharp, deliberate. "No law has the right to tear a child from a mother's arms just because she is poor. Silas pointed a thick finger toward town. Any man who uses wealth and legislation to trample on basic human rights is not an enforcer of the law. He is a tyrant, and a tyrant must be actively stopped. We don't respect laws that strip people of their humanity. We break them. We challenge them in the daylight. If society says a poor widow has no right to her own flesh and blood, then it is our duty as decent men to stand between her and that society. Hiram stared at him. The old cowboy slowly nodded. He took the toothpick out of his mouth. "So," Hiram said, "we fight." "We fight," Silas confirmed, "but we do it smart, sir." Night fell fast and hard over the prairie. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a hunting knife. Martha was in the bedroom at the top of the stairs. She was exhausted, but her lamp was still burning. Will had been quiet all through supper. He hadn't asked about the yelling. He hadn't asked about the yellow envelope. He had simply eaten his stew, staring at his plate. He missed nothing. He heard everything. Around midnight, Silas was downstairs in his study. He was trying to draft a letter to a lawyer he knew in Kansas City. He was rubbing his temples, a headache blooming behind his eyes. He heard a soft scraping noise from the hallway, a slow, dragging sound. Silas stood up quietly. He walked out of his study. He looked up the wooden staircase. At the top of the landing, outside Martha's bedroom door, was Will. The boy was wearing his nightshirt. He was dragging his heavy wool blanket behind him. He reached his mother's closed door. He didn't knock. He didn't turn the knob. Instead, he lay down. He stretched himself out horizontally across the threshold. He pulled the blanket up to his chin. He placed his small arm flat across the floorboards. He was a human barricade, a tiny 8-year-old wall. If anyone wanted to get into that room to take his mother, or to take him away from her, they would have to step over his body first. Silas watched from the bottom of the stairs. His breath caught in his throat. The image of that small boy, lying on the hard floor in the cold dark, broke something open inside the rancher. Silas didn't go up the stairs. He didn't tell the boy to go back to bed. He understood. A man had to do what he felt was his duty. Will's duty was the door. Silas turned around. He walked into the kitchen. He picked up a heavy wooden chair. He carried it out to the front hallway right at the base of the stairs. He set it down facing the heavy oak front door. He blew out the hallway lamp, plunging the lower half of the house into darkness. He sat down in the chair. He pulled his Colt revolver from his holster. He checked the cylinder by touch. Fully loaded. He laid the heavy gun across his lap. He leaned back in the chair, crossing his arms. Upstairs, a boy guarded his mama. Downstairs, the cowboy guarded them both. Neither of them slept a wink. The smell of black coffee filled the kitchen before the sun even cleared the horizon. Silas sat at the long table. The kerosene lamp was still burning, casting a warm yellow circle against the gray dawn, pressing against the windows. He had not moved from his chair by the front door until he heard the roosters crow. Only then had he put his gun away and moved to the kitchen. On the table in front of him sat a massive, leather-bound book. Revised Statutes of the State of Kansas, 1874. He had dug it out of a cedar chest in the attic. His late wife, Margaret, had ordered it years ago. She had liked reading about how the world was put together. Silas had barely opened it. He was a man of dirt, cattle, and weather. Paper confused him. Words twisted on the page when there were too many of them. But he was trying. He dragged his thick, calloused finger under a line of text. He squinted. Section 4, concerning the wardship of minors, provided the surviving guardian is deemed financially bereft. He rubbed his eyes. It was a maze, a trap made of ink. Thorne's lawyer had written that writ knowing damn well people like Silas couldn't untangle the words. A floorboard creaked. Silas looked up. Martha stood in the doorway. She looked exhausted. The dark circles under her eyes were bruised purple. She wore her faded wrapper, her hair falling loose over her shoulders in dark waves. She looked at him. She looked at the heavy law book on the table. "You've been up all night," Martha said. Just reading, Silas said, closing the book defensively. He didn't want her to see him struggling, trying to find a hole in Thorne's fence. Martha walked into the kitchen. She didn't pour herself a cup of coffee. She walked straight to the table. She reached out and placed her hand flat on the leather cover of the book. "Open it," she said softly. Silas hesitated. "Martha, it's just a lot of legal talk. We need a real lawyer. I'm going to send Ned to Kansas City today." "Kansas City is a 4-day ride," Martha said. "Thorne's men will be here in 2. Open the book, Silas." He opened it. Martha pulled out a chair and sat down next to him. She pulled the book toward her. She adjusted the kerosene lamp, bringing the light closer to the pages. Her posture changed. The weary, frightened widow melted away. Her spine straightened, her chin lifted. Her eyes lost their frantic sheen and grew sharp, cold, calculating. She flipped through the heavy pages. She didn't stumble. She didn't squint. Her eyes tracked the dense paragraphs with practiced speed. She bypassed the chapter on wardship completely and flipped toward the back of the book, to the sections on county jurisdiction. Silas watched her. He was mesmerized. "Where is Thorne's writ?" she asked, not looking up from the pages. Her voice was brisk, authoritative. Silas pulled the yellow envelope from his shirt pocket and handed it to her. Martha unfolded the document. She placed it side by side with the law book. Her eyes darted between the 2 texts. "Thorne filed this in the Redemption Municipal Court," she muttered, tracing a line on the writ. "Signed by Mayor Higgins." "Higgins owes Thorne money," Silas said. "Everyone knows that." "It doesn't matter what he owes," Martha said. A sharp, triumphant smile touched the corner of her lips. She tapped her finger hard on the law book. "Look here, Section 12. Jurisdiction over the severance of parental rights in cases of insolvency must be heard by a district circuit judge, not a municipal magistrate." Silas leaned in. "Meaning what?" "Meaning Mayor Higgins has no legal authority to sign this writ," Martha said. "It's a piece of paper, nothing more. Thorne tried to fast-track it locally because he knew a district judge in the city would demand a formal hearing." She flipped another page in the book. "And here," she continued, her voice gaining momentum, "the statute he cited, 1874. It specifically states a mother can only be stripped of custody if she is found criminally negligent or medically incapacitated. Poverty by itself requires a state stipend, not a forfeiture of the child. Thorne left that clause out of his petition." Silas stared at her. He was completely dumbfounded. He looked at the dense, impenetrable text. Then he looked at the woman sitting next to him. "How do you know all this?" Silas asked. His voice was a quiet rumble of pure awe. "You're reading that like it's a dime novel." Martha paused. Her hand rested on the open page. For a moment, the walls tried to go back up, the instinct to hide who she was, to remain invisible. But then she looked at Silas. She looked at the man who had sat in a chair all night with a gun in his lap for a child that wasn't his. She owed him the truth. "My maiden name is Sterling," Martha said quietly. Silas didn't react. The name meant nothing to a Kansas cattleman. "My father is Josiah Sterling," she explained. "He sits on the appellate court in Philadelphia. I grew up in a house made of books. I didn't learn to sew until I was 16, but I could recite the Constitution in Latin by the time I was 12. My father wanted a son to take over his practice. He got me. So he taught me anyway, right up until I ran away with a charming, broke frontiersman named Robert Hayes." She looked down at her rough, blistered hands. "I spent 11 years out here trying to forget who I was," she whispered, "trying to be a good pioneer wife, trying to hide the fact that I was smarter than my husband. I buried it. I buried it all so deep." She looked up at Silas. She expected to see intimidation. She expected to see a man uncomfortable with a woman who knew more than him. That was what she was used to. That was why she hid. Instead, Silas was smiling. It was a slow, genuinely admiring smile. "Well, I'll be damned," Silas said softly. "Thorne picked the wrong widow." Martha felt a sudden fierce rush of pride. A fire that had been smothered for a decade suddenly caught oxygen. She sat up completely straight. She looked him right in the eye. "The law is not an exclusive privilege of men, Silas," Martha stated proudly, her voice ringing clear in the quiet kitchen. "This society may strip a widow of her property. It may kick me out of my house, but no one can strip away the intellect and education in my mind. A woman's intellect is the sharpest weapon she has to protect her own dignity. And right now my mind is going to dismantle Elias Thorne piece by piece." Silas nodded slowly, absolute respect radiating from his face. "So," Silas said, leaning back in his chair, "what's the play, counselor?" "I write a rebuttal," Martha said immediately, her brain already moving 10 steps ahead. "I draft a formal objection citing lack of jurisdiction and statutory misrepresentation. I need paper, ink, and a writer to take it directly to the district courthouse in Kansas City. I bypass Thorne completely." "Ned can ride," Silas said. "He's fast." "There's one problem," Martha said, her brow furrowing. "A petition from a woman with no permanent address might be thrown out by the clerk before a judge ever sees it. I need standing in the county. I need a guarantor." Silas didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. "Write my name," he said. Martha looked at him. "Silas, if you sign this, you're legally tying your assets to my dispute if Thorne retaliates." "I own 3,000 acres, free and clear," Silas interrupted calmly. "My credit is good. My name carries weight in this county. You write the paper. I sign it. We drop an anvil on Elias Thorne." Martha stared at him. Her eyes grew wet, but she blinked the tears away rapidly. She wouldn't cry, not now. She had work to do. "I need ink," she said, her voice trembling just slightly. "In the study," Silas said, standing up. "I'll fetch it. You start drafting." He walked out of the kitchen. Martha sat alone at the table. She looked at the heavy law book. She ran her hand over the leather cover. 2 days ago, she was a broken woman, waiting for a train to carry her away in defeat. She was ready to lower her head and accept that the world had beaten her, but not anymore. She heard Will's footsteps on the stairs. The boy came into the kitchen, dragging his blanket, his hair a mess. He rubbed his eyes. "Mama," Will said sleepily. "You're awake early." "I have work to do, Will," Martha said. She smiled at him, a real, fierce, beautiful smile. "Are we leaving today?" he asked, looking at the door. Martha looked at the law book. Then she looked toward the hallway where Silas was walking back with a bottle of black ink and a stack of crisp paper. "No, Will," Martha said firmly. "We aren't leaving. We're going to stay right here. And we are going to fight." If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe to join more journeys like this. The house breathed in the dark, a slow, settling sound. The pine boards contracting against the night chill. It was past midnight, 2 in the morning, maybe. In the kitchen, a single kerosene lamp burned low. Its yellow light flickered over the heavy oak table. Martha sat there. Her shoulders were hunched. Her neck was a tight knot of pain. She held a steel-nibbed pen in her right hand. The inkwell sat open beside her. Scratch, scratch, dip, scratch. She had been writing for 6 hours straight, drafting the formal rebuttal to Elias Thorne's writ. She was using every bit of legal knowledge her father had drilled into her head. She was citing precedents. She was exposing jurisdictional flaws. She was fighting for her son's life on paper. Her hand was a ruin. She hadn't held a pen for hours at a time in 11 years. Her fingers were cramped. The side of her palm was stained black with ink. A raw red blister had formed against her middle finger where the pen rested. It had broken open an hour ago. She kept writing anyway. She winced. A sharp tremor shot up her wrist. She dropped the pen. It clattered against the wood. She rubbed her eyes with the heel of her left hand. She was so tired, her bones ached. From the doorway, a shadow moved. "You're going to bleed on the paper." Martha jumped. She turned in her chair. Silas stood there. He was wearing his canvas trousers and a faded flannel shirt, untucked. He hadn't been asleep. He walked into the kitchen. His boots made no sound. He didn't look at the stack of legal papers. He looked at her hand. "I'm almost finished," Martha said. Her voice was raspy. "I just need to finish the closing argument." "The courthouse doesn't open until Monday," Silas said. "The paper will wait. Your hand won't." He walked past her. He went to the iron stove. The fire had died down to glowing orange coals. Silas threw a split log onto the grate. He used the iron poker to stir the embers. The fire flared up, catching the dry bark. He took the heavy tin kettle, carried it to the hand pump at the sink, and filled it. He set it on the hottest part of the stove. Martha watched him. She didn't speak. She didn't know what to say. He didn't ask how the writing was going. He didn't ask if she was winning. He just stood by the stove, waiting for the water to boil. A few minutes later, the kettle began to hiss. A thin stream of white steam curled into the cold kitchen air. Silas took a clean wooden basin from the shelf. He poured the hot water into it. He added a splash of cold water from the pitcher to temper it. He tested the heat with his thumb. He picked up the basin. He walked back to the table and set it down right next to her scattered legal drafts. He pulled up a chair. He sat facing her. "Give me your hand," Silas said. Martha froze. She looked at the warm water. She looked at his face. Her instinct, honed over years of surviving a bad marriage and a hard frontier, was to pull away, to hide the injury, to handle it herself. "It's just a blister," she said. Her voice was tight. "I can wash it." "I know you can," Silas said gently. "But you don't have to." He didn't reach across the table to grab her. He just held his hand out, palm up, waiting. The space between them felt suddenly electric. It wasn't about the water. It wasn't about the blister. It was about the surrender. Martha's breath hitched. Slowly, her hand trembling, she reached out. She placed her right hand in his. His skin was rough, calloused from ropes and reins and hard labor, but his touch was unbelievably careful. He guided her hand down into the wooden basin. The warm water swallowed the ache. The heat sank right into her cramped joints. Martha let out a long, shaky breath. She closed her eyes for a second. Silas took a clean linen cloth. He dipped it in the water. Gently, methodically, he began to wash the dried ink from her skin. He rubbed his thumb over her knuckles. He cleaned around the broken blister, careful not to press on the raw skin. They sat in silence. The only sound was the soft slosh of the water. Martha looked at his bowed head. She watched his thick fingers treating her hand like it was made of spun glass. A terrifying, overwhelming feeling began to swell in her chest. It felt like safety, and safety terrified her more than the cold ever did. "I don't know how to do this," Martha whispered. The words slipped out before she could catch them. Silas didn't look up. He kept working the cloth over her palm. "Do what?" "Rely on someone," she said. Her voice shook. The walls were coming down and she couldn't stop them. "Every time I have ever trusted a man to catch me, I hit the ground. My father, my husband. I learned to stand on my own 2 feet because I had to. If I lean on you, Silas, if I start to lean and you step away, I won't survive the fall this time. She tried to pull her hand back. A reflexive retreat. Silas tightened his grip. Just slightly. Enough to keep her hand in the warm water. He stopped washing. He looked up. His gray eyes locked onto hers. They were steady, unshakable. "Genuine affection doesn't make a person weak, Martha," Silas stated. His voice was a low, resonant rumble. He spoke each word clearly, making sure it anchored deep in her mind. "Allowing yourself to be vulnerable in front of someone else and accepting care isn't a collapse. It is the exact opposite. It's courage. It's the first crucial step for your internal wounds to truly scab over. We all have the right to be loved again. We all have the right to rest." Martha stared at him. A tear broke loose. It tracked hot down her cheek. "I am not a weak man," Silas continued softly. "And I don't step away. He lifted her hand from the water. He took a dry towel and patted her skin dry. He folded the towel over her hand and held it between both of his. Martha didn't pull away. For the first time in 11 years, she let herself be held. A soft scuffing sound came from the hallway. They both turned. Will stood in the doorway. He was holding his blanket. His eyes were half closed with sleep. "Mama?" Will mumbled. "I heard talking." Martha quickly wiped her cheek with her free hand. "Everything is fine, sweetheart. Just finishing up." Will looked at Silas. He looked at Silas holding his mother's hand. The boy didn't look alarmed. He just nodded slowly, like he was confirming something he already knew. "Okay," Will said. He turned around and walked back toward the stairs. Silas let go of her hand. He stood up. He picked up the basin of water. "Finish the paper," Silas said quietly. "Then get some sleep." He walked to the sink and poured the water out. He didn't look back, but the warmth of his hands stayed on her skin long after he left the room. Martha watched Silas walk out of the kitchen. The heavy thud of his boots faded up the wooden stairs. She looked down at her hand. It was clean. The ink was gone. The raw edges of the blister had softened. She flexed her fingers. The cramping ache had retreated, replaced by a lingering warmth. She picked up the steel nib pen again. It felt different in her hand this time. Less like a burden, more like a sword. She pulled the final sheet of parchment toward her. She dipped the pen into the inkwell. She began to write the closing paragraph of her legal petition. Her mind was astonishingly clear. The exhaustion that had been dragging her down for hours seemed to have evaporated with the steam from that tin basin. She wrote with a newfound ferocity. She wasn't just fighting Elias Thorne anymore. She was fighting for the life that was slowly taking shape around her. She was fighting for the boy asleep at the top of the stairs, and the man who had stayed awake all night to guard them both. Therefore, she wrote, her handwriting flowing strong and bold, the petitioner demands that this writ be dismissed with prejudice, and that the Municipal Court of Redemption be barred from further interference in matters strictly bound by state appellate jurisdiction. She signed her name at the bottom, Martha Sterling Hayes. She hadn't used her maiden name on a legal document in a decade. It felt like claiming a piece of herself back from the dirt. She set the pen down. She carefully blew on the wet ink to dry it. She gathered the pages. 5 sheets of dense, undeniable legal arguments. She tapped them evenly against the oak table. She slid them into a fresh leather folio she had found on Silas's desk. It was done. She stood up. Her back popped. The fire in the stove had died down to a dull red glow. The kitchen was cold again, but she didn't feel it. She walked out into the hallway. The house was dead silent. She climbed the stairs slowly. Her legs felt heavy. She reached the top landing. Will was not sleeping across her threshold tonight. He was in his bed, under the thick quilt. He had abandoned his post. Martha stood in the doorway of her bedroom and looked at her sleeping son. Silas's words echoed in her mind. Children have the right to simply be children. Will had seen Silas holding her hand, and Will had gone back to bed. The boy had recognized in his own quiet 8-year-old way that the perimeter was secure, that he didn't have to carry the rifle anymore. Martha walked into the room. She undressed in the dark. She slipped into the cold bed. She pulled the blankets up to her chin. For the first time since Robert died, she didn't lie awake listening for footsteps. She didn't catalog her debts in the dark. She just closed her eyes. She thought about calloused hands in warm water. She thought about a man who didn't step away. Martha Hayes finally slept. The dawn came hours later, slipping pale gray light through the frosted window panes. It revealed a room that was stark, bare, yet profoundly peaceful. The wind outside had died down to a gentle whisper, brushing against the pine siding of the ranch house. Martha's breathing was slow and rhythmic, matching the deep, settling quiet of the morning. Down in the yard, the roosters began their morning call. The sound of a heavy barn door sliding on its iron track echoed across the property. Hiram and Javier were up, starting the morning chores. Martha didn't stir. She was dreaming. Not of foreclosures, not of Elias Thorne. She was dreaming of a wide, open prairie and a fence being built, post by post, strong enough to hold back the storms. The trouble didn't come sneaking in. It arrived with a loud, brassy jingle of expensive harness bells. It was just past noon. The Kansas sun was bright, baking the mud in the yard into hard, cracked ridges. Martha was on the porch, shaking out a heavy woven rug. She heard the horses first, high-stepping, fast, not workhorses. She lowered the rug. Coming up the long dirt driveway was a polished black carriage. It had bright red spoke wheels and a lacquered roof. It was pulled by two matching dappled grays. It was a vehicle that had no business being on a dirt road in Colfax County. The carriage pulled into the yard, kicking up a cloud of pale dust. Silas stepped out of the barn. He held a pitchfork in one hand. He stopped, narrowing his eyes against the glare of the sun on the lacquered wood. The driver, a man in a stiff wool suit, pulled the horses to a halt. He hopped down and opened the carriage door. A woman stepped out. Martha's heart stopped dead in her chest. The woman wore a traveling dress of deep burgundy velvet. The hem was pristine. She wore a wide-brimmed hat pinned with a dyed ostrich feather. Her posture was flawless. Her face was sharp, aristocratic, and coldly beautiful. It was Clara Sterling, her older sister. Martha dropped the rug. It hit the porch planks with a heavy thud. Clara looked around the yard. She looked at the peeling paint on the barn. She looked at the mud. She looked at Silas, taking in his stained canvas trousers and the sweat on his brow. Her upper lip curled. Just a fraction, a millimeter of absolute disgust. Then she looked at the porch. "Hello, Martha," Clara said. Her voice was loud, cultured, and completely out of place. It sounded like crystals shattering in a tin bucket. Martha couldn't breathe. The air in her lungs turned to ice. 11 years. 11 years of silence. 11 years of pretending the Sterling family didn't exist. And here she was, standing in the middle of a Kansas cattle ranch, bringing the weight of Philadelphia with her. "Clara," Martha managed to say. Her voice was a dry croak. Clara stepped forward. She carefully lifted her velvet skirts to avoid a patch of dried horse manure. She walked toward the porch. Silas stepped into her path. He didn't raise his pitchfork. He just stood there, a solid wall of muscle and bone. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Silas asked. His voice was polite, but it lacked any subservience. Clara stopped. She looked him up and down. "You must be the rancher. Mr. Vance, I presume?" "I am. I am Clara Sterling, Martha's sister. I am here to collect her and my nephew." She spoke to him as if he were the driver of a hired hack. "Please have your men load her baggage. We have a train to catch in Redemption." "I don't take orders from you," Silas said calmly. "And Martha isn't a piece of baggage." Clara's eyes flashed. She turned her attention back to the porch. "Martha," Clara demanded, "are you going to let this dirt farmer speak to me this way? Father sent me. He heard about Robert's death. He heard about the foreclosure. He sent me to bring you home. You've played pioneer long enough." Martha stood frozen. The ghosts of her past were suddenly standing in the daylight, the judgment, the expectations, the relentless crushing pressure of the Sterling name. She looked at Silas. He was watching her, waiting for her cue. "I'm not going back, Clara," Martha said. She forced the words out. Her hands curled into fists in her apron. "This is my home." Clara let out a short, sharp laugh. It held no humor. "This?" Clara gestured wildly at the dusty yard, the corrals, the simple pine house. "This is not a home, Martha. This is a tragedy. You are a Sterling. You were raised to run an estate, not to scrub grease off a cast-iron stove for a hired hand." "Silas isn't a hired hand," Martha snapped, her defensive walls slamming upward, thick and impenetrable. "He owns this land." "Oh, I see," Clara said smoothly. Her eyes darted between Silas and Martha. Her tone dripped with venomous understanding. "You've found a new arrangement, a new way to pay your rent. I suppose a widow with no prospects has to use whatever assets she has left to secure a roof." The words hit Martha like a physical slap across the face. It was the exact fear she had harbored, the exact poison the town of Redemption had whispered about her, that she was a helpless woman trading herself for survival. Hearing it from her own sister's mouth shattered her completely. She looked at Silas. She expected him to defend her. But Silas didn't yell. Silas didn't strike out. He stood perfectly still, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark with furious restraint. "Get off my land," Silas told Clara. His voice was terrifyingly quiet. "I'm not leaving without her," Clara fired back. "You'll leave right now," Silas warned. "Stop it!" Martha screamed. Both of them looked at her. Martha was shaking. The fragile peace she had found last night, the warmth of the water, the safety of the dark, it was gone. It was an illusion. She was just a charity case. A pathetic widow hiding behind a man because she couldn't face her own family. Her pride, her deeply ingrained toxic Philadelphia pride, took the wheel. "Clara, wait in the carriage," Martha ordered. Her voice was pure ice. "Martha, don't," Silas said. He took a step toward the porch. "I said wait in the carriage," Martha yelled at her sister. Clara smiled, a tight, victorious smile. She turned and walked back to the lacquered carriage, stepping neatly into the plush interior. Martha turned and ran into the house. Silas dropped the pitchfork. He took the porch steps two at a time. He caught the screen door before it slammed shut. He followed her inside. Martha was already halfway up the stairs. "Martha," Silas called out. She didn't stop. She reached her bedroom. She threw the door open. She grabbed her battered leather valise from the corner. She threw it onto the bed and popped the brass catches. Silas filled the doorway. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I'm packing," she said rapidly. She was throwing clothes into the bag without folding them. Her hands were frantic. "She's right. I can't stay here. I'm making a fool of myself. I'm making a fool of you." "She's a vicious woman trying to hurt you," Silas said, stepping into the room. "Why are you listening to her?" "Because she's right." Martha spun around. Tears were finally spilling down her face. Angry, bitter tears. "Look at me, Silas. I have nothing. I am hiding in your house because I'm terrified. She looks at me and sees exactly what everyone else sees. A desperate woman attaching herself to the first man who showed her a drop of kindness." "That is not what I see," Silas said firmly. "It doesn't matter what you see," Martha cried out. "It matters what I am. I can't be this. I won't be this." She turned back to the bed. She shoved the last of Will's shirts into the bag. She tried to force the leather lid down. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't engage the brass clasps. Silas stepped forward. He put his hands over hers, stopping her frantic movements. "You're running," he said. "I am surviving," she shot back, pulling her hands free. "No," Silas corrected. "You survived Elias Thorne. You survived the cold. Right now, you are just running away because someone asked you to stand still." Martha grabbed the handle of the valise. She shoved past him. She practically ran down the stairs. The heavy bag bumped against her legs. She reached the bottom landing. Will was standing there. He was holding his small wooden carving of a horse. Javier had made it for him yesterday. He looked at his mother. He looked at the heavy leather bag. "Mama?" Will asked. His voice was very quiet. "Are we going on the train?" Martha stopped. The sight of her son looking so small in the dark hallway broke her momentum. "Yes, Will," she said, trying to steady her voice. "Aunt Clara is outside. We're going to Philadelphia. We're going to see your grandfather." Will looked past her, up the stairs. Silas was standing at the top, his silhouette dark against the window light. Will looked back down at his wooden horse. He didn't cry. He didn't throw a fit. He just spoke with the calm, devastating logic of an observant child. "If we leave," Will said slowly, "Mr. Silas will get sick." Martha froze. "What?" "He has the lonely sickness," Will stated, looking up at her with large, serious eyes. "I can see it in his eyes, Mama. They look just like your eyes used to, before we came here." The words hit Martha harder than anything Clara had said. the lonely sickness. She looked at the front door. She could hear the horses outside, stamping their hooves impatiently. She could hear Clara tapping her cane against the carriage floorboard. "Go get your coat, Will," Martha whispered. It felt like she was swallowing broken glass. "Mama, please," Will said. "Get your coat," she snapped louder than she intended. Will flinched. He nodded quickly. He ran to the peg by the kitchen door and grabbed his jacket. Martha opened the front door. The bright sunlight hit her face. It felt harsh, unforgiving. She stepped out onto the porch. Clara was watching from the carriage window. Silas came down the stairs. He walked out onto the porch behind her. He didn't try to stop her again. He didn't grab her arm. He just stood there. Martha walked down the steps. The valise was heavy in her hand. The mud pulled at her boots. Every step felt like a mistake, but her pride was a tyrant, and it was driving her forward. She reached the carriage. The driver took her bag and strapped it to the rear rack. Will walked out of the house. He didn't look at Silas. He kept his eyes on the ground. He climbed into the carriage, sitting as far away from Clara as possible. Martha put her foot on the iron step. She stopped. She turned around and looked at the porch. Silas was standing by the wooden railing. He was watching her. He wasn't glaring. He wasn't begging. He was just standing there, solid and immovable. A man who knew how to wait. A man who knew how to stay. "I'm sorry," Martha whispered into the wind. She didn't know if he heard her. She climbed into the carriage. She shut the door. The driver cracked his whip. The carriage lurched forward. The heavy wheels rolled over the hard-baked ruts, carrying her away from the only place she had felt safe in 11 years. She stared straight ahead. She didn't look back. She couldn't. If she looked back, the walls would crack entirely, and she would never make it to the train. The carriage rolled forward. Hard wooden wheels hit deep ruts in the dirt road. Every bump jolted Martha's bones. The lacquered interior smelled of lavender water and expensive leather. It smelled like Philadelphia. It smelled like a cage. Clara did not stop talking. She sat across from Martha. Her posture was perfectly rigid. She smoothed the velvet on her lap. She talked about the family estate. She talked about the neighbors. She talked about how long it would take for the social circles to forget Martha's little frontier mistake. "Father has already arranged a tutor for the boy," Clara said. She didn't look at Will. She just pointed a gloved finger in his general direction. "He has a lot of catching up to do. And you, Martha, you will need a completely new wardrobe. We cannot have you walking through the front door looking like a scullery maid." Martha didn't hear the words. Not really. They washed over her like dull rain on a tin roof. She looked down at her hands, resting in her lap. The knuckles were red. The blister on her middle finger was healing. She thought about the warm basin of water. She thought about calloused hands holding hers, not pulling, not grabbing, just holding. She looked out the small carriage window. The Kansas prairie stretched out, an endless ocean of yellow grass under a wide, uncaring sky. "He's getting smaller," Will whispered. Martha turned her head. Will was sitting next to her, his face pressed to the glass. He wasn't crying. His face was entirely blank. "Who is getting smaller, Will?" she asked softly. "Mr. Silas," Will said. His breath fogged the glass. "He's still standing by the gate. He hasn't moved." Martha leaned forward. She looked past Will's shoulder. The ranch was a mile behind them now, just a collection of tiny wooden blocks on the horizon. But at the edge of the property, where the dirt driveway met the main road, a dark figure stood. He was perfectly still. The cowboy never left. He was watching her go, letting her make her own choice. Martha sat back against the plush velvet seat. Her chest felt tight. The air in the carriage was suddenly too thin to breathe. She was running. Silas had told her that, and he was right. She wasn't leaving because she missed Philadelphia. She hated Philadelphia. She wasn't leaving to save Will. Silas had already sworn to protect him. She was leaving because she was terrified. She was terrified of belonging somewhere. She was terrified that if she let herself love that man, and he died or he left, she would shatter completely. But hiding in a gilded cage wasn't surviving. It was just dying slower. "Tell the driver to stop," Martha said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through Clara's endless chatter like a razor. Clara stopped adjusting her gloves. She looked up. "Excuse me?" Martha sat up straight. The fog in her head cleared. The crushing weight of 11 years of fear lifted off her shoulders. "I said, tell the driver to stop the carriage." Clara frowned. "Don't be ridiculous, Martha. We have a train to catch. We are already behind schedule." Martha didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply leaned over, grabbed the silver handle on the door, and pushed. The door unlatched. The wind roared into the cabin. "Martha! Have you lost your mind?" Clara screamed, grabbing the door frame. The driver heard the commotion. He yanked on the reins. The carriage skidded to a violent, dusty halt. Martha grabbed her battered valise from the floorboard. She looked at Will. "Come on," she said. Will didn't ask questions. A massive, brilliant smile broke across his face. The tension melted out of his small shoulders. He scrambled down from the seat and jumped out onto the dirt road. Martha stepped down after him. She slammed the carriage door shut. Clara pushed the window down. Her face was flushed with fury. "Martha Sterling, if you walk away from this carriage, Father will cut you off completely. You will be dead to this family. You will have nothing." Martha looked at her sister. She felt no anger, only a deep, abiding pity. "I have everything," Martha said. She turned her back on the carriage. She took Will's hand, and she began to walk. She didn't look back when the driver cracked the whip. She didn't look back when the sound of the harness bells faded into the wind. She walked, tossing her heavy bag from one hand to the other. Her boots hit the hard dirt in a steady, determined rhythm. A mile was a long way in a heavy wool dress, but she didn't slow down. Up ahead, the figure at the gate began to grow larger. Silas was still there. He had his hands in his pockets. The brim of his hat was pulled low. As Martha and Will drew closer, Silas took a single step forward. Then he stopped, waiting for her to cross the final distance. Martha stopped 3 feet away from him. She was breathing hard. Her hair was blown wild by the wind. She dropped the heavy valise in the dirt. Silas looked at the bag. He looked at Will. Then he looked at her. "You missed your train," Silas said. His voice was rough, shaky. "I told them to stop," Martha said, catching her breath. "I told them I wasn't going." "Why?" he asked. He needed to hear it. Martha looked him right in the eye. She didn't hide behind her walls. She laid it all out in the open. "I didn't come back because I need a man to shelter me so I can survive the winter," Martha declared, her voice ringing clear and strong over the prairie wind. "I came back because I'm a free human being with the right to decide where I belong. No one dictates my life anymore. Not my sister, not my father. I choose my own path, and I choose to stay here as your equal partner, Silas. Not as a refugee, not as a charity case, but as a woman who wants to be exactly where she is." Silas stared at her. The last remnants of his own guarded hesitation vanished. He didn't say a word. He reached out, closed the space between them, and took both of her hands in his. His grip was solid, warm, anchoring. "Then welcome home, Martha," Silas said softly. Will looked up at them. He grinned, picked up the heavy valise, and started dragging it up the driveway toward the house. "Come on," Will called over his shoulder. "Buster needs brushing." Martha laughed. It was a bright, genuine sound. Silas pulled her gently toward the open gate. They walked back to the house together. The courtroom in Kansas City smelled of lemon wax and stale tobacco. It was a vast room, high ceilings, heavy oak benches. It was built to make people feel small, to make them feel insignificant before the law. Elias Thorne sat at the plaintiff's table. He wore a tailored suit. He looked bored. He had bought judges before. He expected this to take 5 minutes. Martha sat at the defense table. She wore her gray wool dress. Silas sat right beside her, solid, unmoving. The district judge, a stern man with white whiskers, banged his gavel. He picked up the leather folio Martha had submitted. He read the first page. Then he read the second. Thorne's lawyer stood up to speak. The judge held up a hand, silencing him instantly. The courtroom was dead quiet. The judge looked over the rim of his spectacles. He looked at Thorne. He looked at Martha. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said, his voice echoing off the wood paneling, "are you aware that filing a fraudulent writ outside of your local jurisdiction carries a penalty of perjury?" Thorne stood up. His bored expression vanished. "Your Honor, the widow is completely destitute. It is a matter of child welfare." "The widow," the judge corrected sharply, tapping Martha's drafted papers, "has submitted a legal rebuttal that is more thoroughly cited than anything your overpriced attorney has presented in my courtroom all year. She has firmly established her guardianship, her intellect, and her backing by Mr. Silas Vance, a man of excellent standing." The judge brought the gavel down with a heavy crack. "Petition denied, with prejudice. Mr. Thorne, if you ever try to circumvent the appellate courts in my district again, I will have the marshals arrest you. Court is adjourned." Martha let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 2 years. Silas put his hand on her shoulder. A firm, warm squeeze. They had won. They walked out of the courthouse and onto the bustling city street. The sun was shining. The air tasted clean. But waiting by their wagon at the end of the street was Clara. She hadn't left for Philadelphia yet. Her carriage was parked nearby. She looked at Martha. She had seen Thorne storm out of the building. She knew the verdict. Martha walked up to her sister. Silas stood a few paces back, giving them space, but keeping a close eye. "You won," Clara said. Her tone was flat. "I did?" Martha said. Clara sighed, a sharp, impatient sound. She looked at the dirt on her polished shoes. "I wasn't going to tell you," Clara said slowly. "Father ordered me not to. But since you are so intent on throwing your life away in the mud, you might as well know the truth." Martha frowned. "The truth about what?" "About Robert," Clara said. "And the debts." Martha's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" Clara looked her right in the eye. "Father knew, Martha. Before you ever eloped, Father ran a background check on Robert Hayes. He knew the man was a degenerate gambler. He knew Robert owed money to dangerous men in the city." The street noise seemed to fade away. "He knew? And he let me run away with him?" "He didn't just let you," Clara sneered. "He facilitated it. He made sure the night watchman was gone when you sneaked out. He let you ruin yourself." Martha felt physically sick. "Why?" "Because you were defiant," Clara said, as if it made perfect sense. "You read too many books. You argued with his colleagues. Father said you needed to be broken before you could be useful. He said he would let you fall to the very bottom. He wanted to see if you were strong enough to survive it. He called it a test, a necessary trial to forge your character. When you hit rock bottom, he knew you would come crawling back, finally ready to obey." Martha stared at her sister. For 11 years, she had thought her father was simply disappointed, cold, distant. She never imagined he was the architect of her suffering. He had actively sent her into a life of debt, fear, and poverty just to break her spirit. "He loves you, Martha," Clara added, entirely missing the horror on her sister's face. "He just needed you to learn your place." A cold, righteous fury erupted in Martha's chest. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She drew herself up to her full height. She looked at Clara with a level of disgust she had never felt for another human being. "Listen to me very carefully, Clara," Martha said. Her voice was sharp, loud, and uncompromising. Every person on the sidewalk could hear her. "Education and love must never be built upon manipulation. Pushing someone to the brink of destruction just to test their endurance is not love. It is abuse. Respect and care must be given unconditionally, or they mean absolutely nothing at all. A father's duty is to guide a child, not to set traps for her in the dark. Tell him his test failed. Tell him I survived despite him, not because of him." Clara took a step back, shocked by the sheer force of Martha's words. "You are making a mistake," Clara whispered. My only mistake was ever believing I needed his approval, Martha said. Do not ever contact me again. Do not come to my home. Goodbye, Clara. Martha turned around. She walked away from her sister. She walked away from Philadelphia, the sterling name and the ghost of her father's toxic shadow. She walked straight to Silas. He had heard it all. He didn't ask if she was okay. He could see the fire in her eyes. He reached out and offered her his hand. Martha took it. "Let's go home, Silas," she said. "Wagon's ready," he replied. They climbed up to the bench. Silas snapped the reins and they drove out of the city, leaving the past entirely behind them. Winter broke early that year. By the first week of December, the hard freeze had softened into a cool, crisp chill. Inside the barn, it smelled of sweet hay and leather. Silas walked down the center aisle. He held a new, polished bridle in his hand. He stopped at Buster's stall. Will was inside. He was standing on a wooden crate so he could reach the horse's broad back with the curry comb. He brushed the heavy winter coat with practiced rhythmic strokes. "Will," Silas said. Will stopped brushing. He turned around. "Yes, sir?" Silas leaned his arms against the stall door. He looked at the boy. The dark bags under Will's eyes were gone. The rigid, soldier-like tension in his shoulders had melted away over the last 2 months. He looked like an 8-year-old boy. "I need to ask your permission for something," Silas said. His voice was serious. Will stepped down from the crate. He walked over to the stall door, mimicking Silas's posture. He crossed his arms and looked up. "What is it?" "I want to marry your mother," Silas said plainly. No dancing around the subject. Will didn't blink. He didn't act surprised. "I know." "I figured you did," Silas smiled faintly. "But I'm asking you. You're the man of your family. It's your right to say if you approve of the man joining it." Will looked down at his boots. He kicked at the straw. Then he looked back up. His dark eyes were piercing, cutting straight to the core of the matter. "Do you promise you won't ever leave?" Will asked. His voice wasn't demanding. It was vulnerable. It was the only fear he had left. Silas knelt in the straw. He looked the boy dead in the eye. "I promise," Silas swore. "I will never leave you. I will never leave her. This is my post, and I'm staying on it." Will studied his face, searching for a lie, finding none. The boy nodded slowly. "Okay, but I'm still going to guard Mama, too." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Silas agreed, holding out his hand. Will reached through the wooden slats and shook it. The deal was struck. The wedding happened on a Tuesday. There was no grand church, no white silk dress, no orchestra. They stood in the living room of the ranch house. The fire was roaring in the hearth. Martha wore her blue cotton dress, freshly pressed. Silas wore a clean white shirt and his best dark trousers. The circuit preacher stood before them, holding his worn Bible. Hiram, Javier, and Ned stood by the wall. They had spent all morning scrubbing the mud off their boots for the occasion. Javier had even slicked his hair back with pomade. Will stood right next to Martha. He held her hand. When the preacher asked, "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" Will took a step forward. "I do," Will said loudly. Martha looked down at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She looked up at Silas. The cowboy was smiling. They didn't recite standard vows. They made their own. Silas took her hands. "I don't promise that every season will be easy, Martha. I promise that I will stand right beside you when the hard ones come. I promise to be your equal, your shelter and your friend." Martha squeezed his hands tightly. "I don't promise that I will never be afraid, Silas. But I promise that I will choose you every single day, even when I am. I promise to build this life with you, and I promise to never run away again." The preacher pronounced them man and wife. Silas didn't dip her. He didn't make a show of it. He pulled her close, wrapped his arms around her waist, and kissed her deeply, solidly, grounding her completely to the earth. Hiram cheered. Javier tossed his hat in the air. It was perfect. Epilogue. Spring, 1882, 4 years later. The ink dried quickly on the rough paper of the journal. Will, now 12 years old, sat at the kitchen table. His legs were too long for the chair now. He chewed on the end of his pencil, looking out the window. Out in the yard, a new building stood near the corrals. A small, sturdy schoolhouse. Inside, Martha was standing at a blackboard. Sitting at the desks were Ned, Javier, and 5 children from the neighboring ranches. She was teaching them how to read the state constitution. She did it every Tuesday and Thursday, for free. Will looked down and continued to write. Today, Silas showed me how to check the tension on a wire fence. Mama taught Javier how to spell jurisdiction. I think this is how you build a good place. You don't just build fences to keep things out. You teach people things so they know how to stand up on the inside. Mama says knowledge is the only thing a bank can't foreclose on. He closed the journal. The sun was setting. The Kansas sky exploded into brilliant streaks of violet, gold, and burnt orange. The dinner bell rang. Hours later, the house settled into the night. The stars came out, sharp and cold against the black sky. Will walked out onto the front porch. The air was cool, smelling of damp earth and blooming sage. Silas was sitting on the wooden steps. He was leaning back against the post, whittling a piece of soft pine with his pocket knife. He looked up as Will let the screen door click shut behind him. "Evening, Will," Silas said. "Evening," Will replied. He sat down on the step next to his stepfather. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, just listening to the wind move through the grass, listening to the horses shifting in the barn. Will looked back through the window. Inside the house, the parlor lamp was lit. Martha was sitting in her rocking chair, reading a book. She looked up, caught Will looking through the glass, and smiled warmly. She waved. Will waved back. He looked at Silas. "You know what the best part is now, Silas?" Will asked. His voice was no longer the high pitch of a frightened child. It was steady, calm. Silas stopped whittling. He closed his knife and slipped it into his pocket. He looked at the boy he had helped raise. "What's that, son?" Silas asked. Will leaned back against the porch railing. He looked at the house, then out at the dark, sprawling prairie. "I used to have to stay awake all night," Will said softly. "I had to guard Mama. I thought if I went to sleep, the bad things would come through the door." He looked back at Silas. He smiled. "But now she has 2 guards. One guy watches the outside and the other guy watches the inside. She never has to be alone in the dark again." Silas reached over and rested his heavy, calloused hand on Will's shoulder. "No, she doesn't," Silas agreed. "And neither do you." They sat together on the porch as the night stretched on. The cowboy and the boy, the sentries of the Vance ranch, keeping watch not out of fear, but out of love. And behind them, in the warm, bright house they had built together, Martha read her books, safe, free, and exactly where she belonged. The characters, settings, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional. While certain themes may echo real-life experiences, they are shaped by creative interpretation. The author does not intend to represent or depict any specific individual, organization, or historical event.
Out here on the open prairie, people like to believe that survival belongs to the toughest, the ones who never bend, never ask, never break. But this story reminds us of something deeper, something quieter, something far more human. Strength is not just the ability to endure hardship alone. Sometimes true strength is found in the moment we allow ourselves to be seen, to be helped, to be held together when everything inside us is falling apart. Martha believed that dignity meant standing on her own, even if it meant freezing in the dark. She carried pride like armor because life had taught her that depending on others only leads to loss. But that cold night revealed a truth many of us struggle to accept. Dignity is not diminished by kindness. It is not weakened by accepting help. In fact, it is strengthened by the courage to trust again, even after life has given you every reason not to. And then there is Will. a child forced to grow up too soon, carrying responsibilities no child should ever bear. His story reminds us of the silent burdens children carry when the world around them breaks. But it also shows us the importance of presence, of adults who step in, not to replace love, but to protect it. Because every child deserves the right to rest, to feel safe, and to simply be a child again. Silas, the quiet cowboy in the shadows, represents something this world often forgets: that real goodness doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition or repayment. It simply shows up and stays. His actions teach us that compassion is not weakness. It is a choice. A deliberate, often difficult choice to stand for what is right, even when no one is watching, even when it costs you something. The deeper meaning of this story lies in the connections between people: strangers who become protectors, broken hearts that begin to heal, and the invisible threads of kindness that hold society together. It reminds us that we are not meant to walk through life alone, that in our darkest moments, the smallest act, a coat, a word, a presence, can become the turning point between despair and hope. So what does this story leave us with? It leaves us with the understanding that resilience is not just about standing tall in the storm, but knowing when to lean on someone beside you. It teaches us that love does not always come loudly. It often comes quietly, in the form of patience, protection, and unwavering presence. And most importantly, it reminds us that even in a harsh and unforgiving world, humanity survives through compassion. If there is one thing to carry with you after this story, let it be this: never be ashamed to accept kindness, and never underestimate the power of offering it. Because sometimes the life you save, or the heart you heal, may begin with something as simple as refusing to walk away.